Hello and welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green, and this is another contextualized reading lecture in our Intro to Critical Theory course. We're dealing this week with Female Masculinity by Jack Halberstam. You can look up Jack Halberstam online, and the gender pronouns cover the entire spectrum. And I think that he delights partially in that. Of course, born Judith Halberstam. And so we're dealing with a trans author here. And I think of all of the readings that I've put into this Intro to Critical Theory course, this one comes closest to doing cultural studies. Um, uh, Definitely there's a push towards it in the earlier Frankfurt School stuff, in the sense that Adorno and Horkheimer are starting to do cultural critique or aesthetic critique. And I've characterized that as a shift in 20th century critical theory. It's what makes the discourse kind of its own thing. It's what is presented as at least one of the ways to counter something that was left out of Marx, and doing purely economic analysis or doing purely sociological analysis. This also reads more like a contemporary academic book than most of the other essays that we've been reading throughout our time together in the course. And so you might, if you're reading along, you might find this like much easier to understand. And I appreciate that. And so just as when we're looking at academic books like this, we read the first chapter. Oftentimes the first chapter is the introduction to the text, and it's where the authors are making like the most robust claims of their argument, and the later chapters in the book are dealing with more of the nuances and the support for those claims. So let's jump in here. Halberstam opens with an introduction to female masculinity, or masculinity without men. What is masculinity? This has been probably the most common question that I have faced over the past 5 years while writing on the topic of female masculinity. This is coming out in 1998, right? So just like Judith Butler, we were in the 1990s, and with Halberstam as well. He goes on, if masculinity is not the social and cultural and indeed political expression of maleness, then what is it? I do not claim to have any definitive answer to this question, but I do have a few proposals about why masculinity must not and cannot and should not reduce down to the male body and its effects. Okay, so just like femininity isn't just about the female body, masculinity is not about the masculine body. Um, he goes on, I also venture to assert that although we seem to have a difficult time defining masculinity, as a society, we have little trouble in recognizing it. And indeed, we spend massive amounts of time and money ratifying and supporting the versions of masculinity that we enjoy and trust. Many of these heroic masculinities depend absolutely on the subordination of alternative masculinities. And he says, I claim in this book that far from being an imitation of maleness, female masculinity actually affords us a glimpse of how masculinity is constructed as masculinity. In other words, female masculinities are framed as the rejected scraps of dominant masculinity in order that male masculinity may appear to be the real thing. But what we understand as heroic masculinity has been produced by and across both male and female bodies. And so we see that Halberstam is building it conceptually in some of the same areas that Judith Butler was in our last talk, right? That if, I mean, of course, like one way to talk about this, and the common way of talking about it is of course, that gender roles are socially constructed, that there's a difference between masculinity and maleness. Although Judith Butler will argue, and we didn't read Bodies That Matter, but she makes the important point, I think, in Bodies That Matter, that even our categories for biological sex are historically determined as well. So we can read them as socially determined, at least in the ways that discourse moves and operates and disciplines us and our bodies and our subjectivities, in the sense that Foucault was already pointing towards us with governmentality. So hopefully you're seeing a thread of connection here into this week that I've done on gender theory, which is just like one discursive trajectory of broader critical theory. So Halberstam's going to jump in here and talk about some of these cartoonishly big versions of heroic masculinity. Um, but he talks about in the second paragraph here, the kind of because of this kind of idea that Butler was put of imitation, that somehow something is a bad copy, right? This is what imitation and gender insubordination was about with Butler. That if we regard female masculinity as a bad copy of heroic male masculinity, and that is the way, at least at this particular time period, that Halberstam is saying this, then we're missing out on something, right? So Halberstam says the widespread indifference to female masculinity, I suggest, has clearly ideological motivations and has sustained the complex social structures that wed masculinity to maleness and to power and domination. Um, I firmly believe that a sustained examination of female masculinity can make crucial interventions within gender studies, cultural studies, queer studies, and mainstream discussions of gender in general. So we're thinking about this coming out in 1998. This is before national debates about all gender restrooms, for example. And so that's going to come up a little bit here. But I just want us to situate it historically from when it comes out. And that's my main goal in introducing us to the discourse. By looking back at these writers from the 1990s, we can see pretty obviously, I think, in the United States anyway, that discussions around gender have changed quite a bit in the past 25 years. But they were, in many ways, I feel like theorists like Butler and Halberstam, they are ahead of their time, and they also have things to say to us today, especially in ways that gender discussions oftentimes have been in recent times reduced to simply identity politics. And I think that for Butler, especially, that's not what's going on, and for Halberstam, there's so many that it's weird because of how present and dominant masculinity is in a sexist and male dominated culture, and at the same time there are few studies of masculinity itself, right? Like critical studies, all sorts of information we men get about how to act like men, like real men, that of course that we're dealing with since the time we're young. The next paragraph here, masculinity in this society inevitably conjures up notions of power and legitimacy and privilege. It often symbolically refers to the power of the state and uneven distributions of wealth. Masculinity seems to extend outward into patriarchy and inward into the family. Masculinity represents the power of inheritance, the consequences of the traffic in women, and the promise of social privilege. but obviously many other lines of identification traverse the terrain of masculinity, dividing its power into complicated differentials of class, race, sexuality, and gender. If we call, quote, dominant masculinity, if what we call dominant masculinity appears to be a naturalized relation between maleness and power, then it makes little sense to examine men for the contours of that masculinity's social construction. Masculinity, this book will claim, becomes legible as masculinity where and when it leaves the white male middle class body. And again, I mean, although Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality had arisen during this time in critical race theory, which we haven't dug into a whole bunch in this class, but we've seen the background in folks like Fanon, in critical legal studies, in some of the stuff that Foucault is saying as well, right? So, but Kimberly Crenshaw definitely gives us um, a way of with her analytic. Just a useful critical term, intersectionality, to think about the ways that these power differentials, to use Halberstam's terms, crisscross or traverse different identity categories, and that we're going to have to kind of look at the ratios between the way a person's body is perceived in terms of gender, the way a person's body is perceived in terms of race or ethnicity or class, all of these sorts of things. But I think that the method that Halberstam is going to give us here is to ignore, try to ignore the white male middle class version of masculinity, and that this is going to lend him to focus on this idea of female masculinity. And when we see that when we work through, I guess, the kind of cognitive dissonance that it might cause us ideologically, for those of us who've attached maleness and masculinity to maleness, then we're able to see more of what Halberstam means. So on page 3 here, Elvis comes up. Well, I'm just going to go back to where I just left off there because it was going really well. Arguments about excessive masculinity tend to focus on Black bodies, male and female, Latino, Latina bodies, or working class bodies, and insufficient masculinity is all too often figured in by Asian bodies or upper class bodies. These stereotypical constructions of variable masculinity mark the process by which masculinity becomes dominant in the sphere of white middle class maleness, but also too many studies that currently attempt to account for the power of white masculinity recenter the white male body by concentrating all of their analytical efforts on detailing the forms and expressions of white male dominance. Numerous studies of Elvis, white male youth, white male feminism, and men in marriage and domestications of maleness amass information about a subject whom we know intimately and ad nauseum. And this study professes a degree of indifference to the whiteness of the male and the masculinity of the white male and the project of naming his power. Male masculinity figures in my project as a hermeneutic and as a counterexample to the kinds of masculinity that seem most informative about gender relations and the most generative of social change. Um, she then, or he then goes into Elvis herselvis here, and then into an analysis of the James Bond film Goldeneye. And so this is definitely what's going to locate this work for me in the firmly in the land of cultural theory and cultural studies, which of course we haven't read Stuart Hall in this but in this intro course, but definitely the cultural studies as a kind of program takes the the project of doing oftentimes Marxian economic related readings, but then looking at the production of mass culture or the production of text and textuality, like a lot of literary studies come out of cultural studies, and of course the Caribbean slash British thinker Stuart Hall. A nice double volume collection recently came out of his stuff, and so that's maybe like a missing piece in the long 20th century version that's leading up to studies like Halberstam's here. Um, so we talk. Halberstam talks about how James Bond is kind of a buffoon in this particular version of the film. He's surrounded by other people that he's dependent on as well, even though he uh, embodies this all of these other sort of classic sex appeal um, symbols, the gentleman who gets all of the girls. And so Halberstam contrasts it with Moneypenny and with his boss M, and then with Agent Q here, who, you know, shows up in multiple of, I mean, most James Bond movies. I can't think of one that doesn't have a Q in it. Um, Agent Q, it is no accident that the science nerd is called Agent Q. We read Agent Q as a perfect model of the interpenetration of queer and dominant regimes. Q is precisely an agent, a queer subject who exposes the workings of dominant heterosexual masculinity. The gay masculinity of Agent Q and the female masculinity of M provide a remarkable representation of the absolute dependence of dominant masculinities on minority masculinities. Um, when you take his toys away, James Bond has very little propping up his performance of masculinity. Without the slick suit, the half smile, the cigarette lighter that transforms into a laser gun, our James is our hero without the action or the adventure. The masculinity of the white male, on what we might call epic masculinity, depends absolutely, as any Bond flick demonstrates, on a vast subterranean network of secret government groups, well-funded scientists, the army, and an endless supply of both beautiful bad babes and beautiful good babes. And finally, it relies heavily on the immediately recognizable bad guy. Um, this bad guy, so the bad guy comes in as a figure here, is a standard generic feature for epic masculinity. Think of Paradise Lost and the eschatological separation between God and devil. Satan, if you like, is the original bad guy, which is not to say that the bad guy's masculinity bars him from the rewards of male privilege. On the contrary, bad guys may also look like winners, but they just tend to die more quickly. Indeed, there's currently a line of clothing called Bad Boy that revels in the particular power of the bad guy and reveals how quickly transgression adds up to nothing more than consumerism in the sphere of the white male. And then Halberstam talks about most of my students this semester don't know this, but I definitely remember it from my youth, the no fear gear of the late 1990s. Um, uh, so the rebellious male comes in here, and then Halberstam switches over to tomboys here. Um, what happens when boy rebellion is located not in the testosterone-induced pout of the hooligan, but in the sneer of the tomboy? Tomboyism is generally describes an extended childhood period of female masculinity. If we are to believe general accounts of childhood behavior, tomboyism is quite common for girls and does not generally give rise to parental fears. Because comparable cross-identification behaviors in boys do often give rise to quite hysterical responses, we tend to believe that female gender deviance is much more tolerated than male gender deviance. I'm not sure that tolerance in such matters can be measured, or at any rate that the responses to childhood gender behaviors necessarily tell us anything concrete about the permitted parameters of adult male or female gender deviance. Tomboyism tends to be associated with a, quote, natural desire for the greater freedoms and mobilities enjoyed by boys. Very often it's read as a sign of independence and self-motivation, and tomboyism may even be encouraged to the extent that it remains comfortably linked to a stable sense of girl identity. Skipping down to the end of the paragraph here. Um, Female adolescence represents the crisis of a coming of age as a girl in a male-dominated society. If adolescence for boys represents a rite of passage, much celebrated in Western literature from the form of the Bildungsroman, and an ascension to some version, however attenuated, of social power, for girls, adolescence is a lesson in restraint, punishment, and repression. It is, in the context of female adolescence, that the tomboy instincts of millions of girls are remodeled into compliant forms of femininity. Now, of course, I do think that some of my students might say, well, things have changed in the past 25 years. In some ways, things have changed, but I mean, this is before same-sex marriage is happening, um, but at the same time, we're seeing, at least in the public sphere and the legal sphere, all sorts of legislation against different forms of gender discussion or race discussion in schools, that don't say gay stuff. At the same time that it's rather common for elementary and junior high or some of my current high school students to be using they, them pronouns, and to be working out some of this sort of stuff. And what's so interesting to me is the way that children are are working out through their embodiment or through their resistance to uh, regimes of power that have existed so much longer than their bodies have been on the planet and their minds have been on the planet. And I tend to be fascinated in an encouraging sense of people exploring um, what gender is or resistance to gender categories to begin with. And certainly, I do think that reading some of this material um, is helpful. I don't think that. I mean, on the one hand, it's easy to laugh off maybe somebody who is on the other side of the culture wars, as they're calling them now. Um, uh, for being rather hysterical in their heteronormativity. But when it comes to legislation for what can be talked about in schools or legislation for people's bodies, I think that we do well to not just laugh it off, right? It's easy to if we are comfortable um, uh, in queer and fluid gender discussions and groups of people, it can also lead to a sense of maybe false sense of security, unfortunately. Halberstam uh, then maneuvers back into film analysis here, and the member of the wedding, and then maneuvers over into psychoanalysis on page 8. Halberstam says that psychoanalysis posits a crucial relationship between language and desire, such that language structures desire and expresses, therefore, both the fullness and the futility of human desire. Full because we always desire, futile because we are never satisfied. And this is without digging into Freud or without digging into Jacques Lacan, but that is very much a Lacanian sense of how desire works, that desire can't satisfy us because it's what we look at drives our life. Like when we're depressed, we don't have desire, and then we aren't motivated to get up. And so desire is structured as a kind of lack that maneuvers towards various types of objects, but with an ultimate sort of object as being unattainable. But language becomes the expressive place for this. And so, of course, that leads someone like Halberstam to uh, turn towards literary studies or to turn towards film or some version of textual studies where we see language and language becomes the site of analysis for looking at this material. So bottom of page 8. My book refuses the futility long associated with the tomboy narrative and instead seizes on the opportunity to recognize and ratify differently gendered bodies and subjectivities. Moving from 19th century to um, the present and examining diaries, court cases, novels, letters, films, performance events, critical essays, videos, new items, and testimonies, this book argues for the production of new taxonomies of what Eve K. Sedgwick humorously called nonce taxonomies in Epistemology of the Closet. It's a classic queer studies book. Um, uh, Classifications of desire, psychality, and subjectivity that attempt to intervene in the hegemonic processes of naming and defining. All of that stuff is right back into Foucault, right? So you could go to Foucault, you could go back to Eve Sedgwick, are places for digging into this more. Nonce taxonomies are categories that we use daily to make sense of our worlds, but that work so well, but they work so well that we actually fail to recognize them. In this book, I attempt to bring some of the nonce taxonomies of female masculinity into view, and I detail the histories of suppression of these categories. Here and in the rest of the book, I'm using the topic of female masculinity to explore a queer subject position that can successfully challenge hegemonic models of gender conformity. Female masculinity is a particularly fruitful site of investigation because it has been vilified by heterosexist and feminist/womanist programs alike. Unlike male femininity, which fulfills a kind of ritual function in male homosocial cultures, female masculinity is generally received by hetero and homonormative cultures as a pathological sign of misidentification and maladjustment, as longing to be and to have a power that is always just out of reach. Within a lesbian context, female masculinity has been situated as the place where patriarchy goes to work on the female psyche and reproduces misogyny within femaleness. There have been to date remarkably few studies or theories about inevitable effects of a fully articulated female masculinity on a seemingly fortified male masculinity. Sometimes female masculinity coincides with the excess of male supremacy, and sometimes it codifies a unique form of social rebellion. Often female masculinity is the sign of a sexual alterity, but occasionally it marks heterosexual variation. Sometimes female masculinity marks the place of pathology, and every now and then it represents the healthful alternative to what are considered the histrionics of conventional femininities. So, like any scholarly book, right? Halberstam has identified a gap in the literature. We have had some studies on masculinity, but it tends to focus on this white male middle class masculinity at the expense of marginalized masculinities, including female masculinity. But even within queer communities, Halberstam is saying that female masculinity can be misrecognized. It can be misrecognized if we are still working in terms of a heterodominant way of thinking about society. And but what I mean by that is that um, if we're going to read female masculinity as mimicking or an imitation of a more authentic male heterosexual or cisgendered masculinity, then that's a problem for Halberstam, right? Uh, because then see, like, we might note that that we live in a patriarchal culture and that there's all sorts of sexual inequity in terms of both gender and sexuality more broadly speaking, not to mention sexual orientation. So I think at this, if we're, it might be fine to make that critique of patriarchal society, but if we then assign female masculinity this kind of role that's mimicking the dominant thing, then we tend to vilify that masculine. We look at it showing up uh, within in a woman's body or in a female body, and then and then we see something inauthentic about it, right? Or at worst, we see something that is trying to mimic and dominate in the way that white male middle class masculinity does, right? So I think that there's like a lot of nuance, and so that's the reason for focusing on female masculinity, and also her reason for just like saying like we need to just like not focus on the white male middle class masculinity that we know so well as that we are intimate with already. Um, Next paragraph, page 9. I want to carefully produce a model of female masculinity that remarks on its multiple forms, but also calls for new and self-conscious affirmations of different gender taxonomies. Such affirmations begin not by subverting masculine power or taking up a position against masculine power, but by turning a blind eye to conventional masculinities and refusing to engage. So then we maneuver over onto page 10 and we get like a really nice description of just queer methodology here. So yeah, again, like very much academic book. This is my argument. This is what other people in the field have said about it. This is a gap that I have come to understand from looking at other studies in the field, which prompts the reason for doing my work. And now I'm going to talk about how I do my work. On page 10, maybe I'll just start right before deploying what I would call a queer methodology. I have used some combinations of textual criticism, ethnography, historical survey, archival research, and the production of taxonomies. I call this methodology queer because it attempts to remain supple enough to respond but to the various locations of information on female masculinity and betrays a certain disloyalty to conventional disciplinary methods. Obviously, I could have produced a methodological consistency by confining myself to literary texts, but the queer methodology used here then typifies just one of the forms of refusal that I discussed in my last section. So we're going to like literary products might be one avenue from which we're going to get some sort of images of female masculinity, but in order for the study to work, we have to go across different mediums. And that takes us out of the specific discipline of literary studies or the specific discipline of film studies or the specific discipline of sociology. And so we get this hybrid methodology that's showing up. And I think that it's quite conventional in uh, current day academic spheres to be doing this kind of work. But one of the problems that any academic will know is that we tend to give a lot more lip service to interdisciplinary work, and we talk about its importance, but the funding doesn't show up. And then not only that, as funding is cut for different disciplinary departments, there becomes this need for people who are interdisciplinary, but then the people who are losing their jobs resent the interdisciplinary people, and the interdisciplinary people are trying to do this very difficult work while at the same time having even less resources. And so that becomes a real, there are difficulties in doing this type of work. And uh, they're also like we can't read everything, we can't study every discipline, so there is still room for disciplinary knowledge, and for people who stick in one particular discipline. And but as somebody with two PhDs myself, and I'm a very interdisciplinary thinker, and researcher these days, but it takes a lot of resources, right? Like think about my student loan payments. Um, so when we took turn to cultural studies as a field, as a program here, more broadly speaking, on page 10, Halberstam says, whereas some cultural studies proponents have argued that social science methods for collecting, collating, and presenting sexual data through surveys and other methods of social research tend to rediscover the sexual systems they already know rather than finding out about those who they do not. Social science proponents argue that cultural studies scholars do not pay enough attention to the material realities of queer life. And while there has been plenty of discussion in the academy about the need for interdisciplinary work, there has been far less support for such work in the university at large, just like I was saying. So some things have stayed the same over the past 25 years. Uh, and I do think, I mean, the benefits of people who are really doing this interdisciplinary work is that th- they, someone like Halberstam can tell us like how we can get into disciplinary silos as well. So we need people who are doing all kinds of different work to help us talk to each other. Um, and Halberstam says that he's not gonna shy away from doing kind of this statistical sociology collecting of data, either. We need all of these factors together. Um, on page 11. At a time when the humanities are under severe scrutiny and attack, it is important to point to the reliance of social science methods on strategies such as narrative analysis, interpretation, and speculation. As Lewontin says in his conclusion, quote, how then can there be a social science? The answer surely is to be less ambitious and stop trying to make sociology into a natural science, although it is, indeed, the study of natural objects. This is not to say, however, that traditional social science research methods such as questionnaires are never appropriate. Indeed, there are certain questions that can be answered only by survey methods in the realm of sexuality. For example, how many lesbians are using dental dams? What age groups or social classes do these lesbians belong to? But all too often, surveys are used to try to gather far less factual information, and all subtlety tends to be lost. So there's some irony in the apparent impossibility of applying traditional social science methods to the study of sex, because as queer sociologists are all too quick to point out, many of the theoretical systems that we use to talk about sex, such as the social constructionism, come from sociology. In a recent queer issue of Sociological Theory, a group of sociologists attempted to account for the currently strained relations between sociology theory and queer theory, or sociological theory and queer theory. Stephen Epstein pointed out that sociology asserts that sexuality was socially constructed, and indeed, that without seeking to minimize the importance of other disciplines, I would suggest that neither queer theory nor lesbian and gay studies in general could be imagined in their present forms without the contributions of sociological theory. That's a quote from Epstein. Arlene Stein and Ken Plummer continue Epstein's line of inquiry and add a critique of the present state of queer theory. So, like, this is so great. Like, Halberstam is able to say, like, here's what the sociologists are saying about the queer theorists. Here's what the queer theorists are saying about the sociologists, right? Um, uh, so the critique of the queer theorists is the Queer theorists appreciate the extent to which the texts of literature and mass culture shape sexuality, but their weakness is that they rarely, if ever, move beyond the text. There is a dangerous tendency for the new queer theorists to ignore, quote, real queer life as it is materially experienced across the world, while they play with the free-floating signifiers of text. So can't just stay in the text zone either. Um, Skipping down on page 12 here, the answer to the problem of how to study sexuality, I'm trying to suggest, must lie to some extent on an interdisciplinary approach that I can combine information culled from people and information culled from texts. So whereas Cindy Patton, for example, in Tremble Hetero Swine remarks with dismay on the dominance of textually based forms of queer theory, we must question whether there is a form of queer theory or sexual theory that is not textually based. Isn't a sexual ethnographer studying texts? And doesn't a social historian collate evidence from texts? Sometimes the texts are oral histories, sometimes they might be interview material, sometimes they might be a fiction or an autobiography, but in our basic formula of sex as, quote, private, something that happens when other people are not around, there is no way to objectively observe in the bedroom. Conversely, reading the texts also require historical context and some relation to the lived experience of subjects. The text-based methodologies err on the side of abstraction, and the sociological studies err on the side of overly rationalizing sexual behavior. Finally, although some have criticized literary or cultural studies approaches to identity construction as apolitical or ahistorical, theories that tie up the history of sexuality unproblematically to economics or the movement of capital tend to produce exactly the linear narratives of rational progress and modernization that sexuality seems to resist. A queer methodology, in a way, is a scavenger methodology that uses different methods to collect and produce information on subjects who have been deliberately and or accidentally excluded from traditional studies of human behavior. The queer methodology attempts to combine methods that are often cast as being at odds with each other, and it refuses the academic compulsion towards disciplinary coherence. Although this book will be immediately recognizable as a work of cultural studies, it will not shy away from more empirical methods associated with ethnographic research. It's like a really, for me, compelling articulation of the state of the field, at least in the 1990s. And I feel like even working in academia today, I feel like it's maybe hard to see just how refreshing something like this might have been in the 1990s. Maybe it's refreshing to folks now too. Constructing masculinities on page 13, um, middle of the paragraph. Um, this is referring to um, a panel discussion. At the end of the evening, only one panelist had commented on the limitations of a discussion of masculinity that interpreted masculinity as a synonym for male or maleness. So Halberstam is talking about like a recent conference, right? So definitely like giving us a lay of the land for what's going on in academic studies of this stuff, right? This lonely intervention highlighted the gap between mainstream discussions of masculinity and men and ongoing queer discussions about masculinity, which extend far beyond the male body. Indeed, in answer to the naive question that began the evening, why masculinities, why now? One might state, because masculinity in the 1990s has been recognized as, at least in part, a construction by female as well as male-born people. Um, uh, Again, so then Halberstam turns over to Judith Butler to talking about melancholy, gender. This is some of the stuff that's coming up at the very end of Imitation and Gender Insubordination. But ultimately, with Sedgwick and with Butler, um, Halberstam is going to go ahead and say that there's a gap in the literature around female masculinity. At the bottom of page 14, um, uh, Halberstam says, what is it then, to paraphrase Eve Sedgwick's essay, um, uh, what is it then that, to phrase Eve Sedgwick's essay, makes it so difficult not to presume the essential relation between masculinity and men? If we know this, we hear this stuff all the time, that gender is socially constructed. Why is there such a tendency, even when we are talking about and attempting to criticize masculinity, that within that, there's also the tendency to align masculinity with the male body. Um, Middle of page 15, I will claim, or this continued refusal in Western society to admit ambiguously gendered bodies into functional social relations, evidenced, for example, by our continued use of either or bathrooms, or either or women or men, it is, I will claim, sustained by a conservative and protectionist attitude by men in general towards masculinity. Such an attitude has been bolstered by a more general disbelief in female masculinity. That it not only is it an imitation, that it doesn't even exist to begin with. Um, Last sentence down there. Um, uh, there is still no general acceptance or even recognition of masculine women and boyish girls. This book addresses itself to the collective failure to imagine and ratify the masculinity produced by, for, and within women. Um, then some coverage of this book, Boys, Masculinities in Contemporary Culture, edited by Paul Smith, and some critiques of that. Halberstam says on page 16, although the recognition of a host of masculinities makes sense, Smith chooses to focus on dominant white masculinity to the exclusion of the other masculinities he has listed. Smith predictably warns the reader not to fall into the trap of simply critiquing dominant masculinity or simply celebrating minority masculinities. And then he makes the following foundational statement. This is a quote. And it may well be the case, as some influential voices often tell us, that masculinity or masculinities are, in some sense, are some real sense not the exclusive property of biologically male subjects. It's true that many female subjects lay claim to masculinity as their property, yet in terms of culture and political power, it still makes a difference when masculinity coincides with biological maleness. Um, and this is like Halberstam's critical voice is really nuanced and nice here. Halberstam says, what's immediately noticeable to me here is the odd attribution of immense power to those influential voices who keep telling us that masculinity is not the property of men. There's no naming of these influential voices, and we are left supposing that that influence has rendered the female masculinity theorists so powerful that names are irrelevant. These voices are, one might suppose, are hegemonic. Um, uh, they're all around us. Smith goes on to plead with the reader, asking us to admit the intersection of maleness and masculinity does still make a difference. His appeal here to common sense allows him to sound as if he's trying to reassert some kind of rationality to a debate that is spinning off into totally inconsequential discussions. And then just skipping down a sentence. As I argued earlier in the chapter, however, precisely because white male masculinity has obscured all other masculinities, we have to turn away from its construction to bring other more mobile forms of masculinity to light. And over on page 17 here, the most notable, excuse me, just uh, This is Halberstam just analyzing a passage here. I don't think I need to read that bit. It's just more nuanced analysis here. And so if we skip over to page 18 just for time, there's um, uh, some discussion of OJ here, or the OJ Simpson case. OJ Simpson, as I'm making this video, just died last week. So that was a big moment. And so we're seeing that what Halberstam is doing as a critical theorist, if we're looking at this work as critical theory, is bringing it into the moment, right? Talking about the contemporary um, uh, moment. So doing all of the classic things that Frankfurt School theorists were doing, right? Is we're doing a sociological analysis. We're going to be incorporating some forms of textual study and historical analysis, some forms of economic analysis, and we're also going to be trying to have our fingers on the pulse of some sort of contemporary situation, perhaps for a site of intervention. Um, on page 18, the paragraph at the bottom, um, I'm taking so much time and effort to discount Smith's introduction to boys because there is a casualness to his essay that both indicates a lack of any real investment in the project of alternative masculinity. So this is like a full-on critique of this one particular book. Um, and it suggests an unwillingness to think through the messy identifications that make up contemporary power relations around gender, race, and class. Over on page 19, I have in my margins here auto theory, which has become a genre of literature. If we think about, I mean, there's in contemporary fiction writing, we talk about auto theory, but I think that if we look at a book like Eileen Miles's Chelsea Girls from the 1990s, which says on the cover, it's a novel, but when we read it, it seems to be a collection of vignettes that seem to be like very, very autobiographical. That kind of blurring of the lines between autobiography and fiction, and then also what is the work of a novel supposed to do? So how does the theory of the novel play into things? And it's a critique, of course. Auto theory is a critique of the Bildungsroman or the classic Enlightenment novel or the experience-driven novel, right? And so part of what auto theory does in that literature is it does the aesthetic work that that the theorists are sort of talking about here. Halberstam says on page 19, although I make my own masculinity the topic of my last chapter, it seems important to state that this book is an attempt to make my own female masculinity possible, credible, or real. And so we see that there's this very personal involvement in the academic study here. Halberstam then turns to the bathroom problem. And this is interesting because of the way that passing might work or not passing, and the way that different bathrooms, at least according to Halberstam in the late 1990s, might have to bring it up into the 2020s. And again, I know like many of my students, when we read this in class last week, a lot of my younger students were saying like, we just don't like our generation just doesn't care about um about this stuff. We're not hung up on it. And it's like, well, you might feel that way about your generation, but that isn't stopping multiple states from having anti-trans legislation, right? Or that is refusing to allow us to talk about this stuff in public schools, right? So that that's something I think that we need to think about, because I think that can sound to me a little bit like the way that in the post-Obama years, people used to have like a post-race perspective, right? That like, oh, because we elected an African American to presidents, then America doesn't have a race problem anymore, or something like that. When very much as a reaction to the election of Barack Obama, there was a revanchism, there was a revenge and a swelling up of white supremacist groups that have emerged in recent years, even with the January 6th incidents recently. So I would push back against people who want to just say, oh, this is just dated stuff. It doesn't really matter. And it might be really, really different in different parts of the country, and certainly different in different parts of the world, right? Um, so on page 21, uh, the concept of passing shows up. For many gender deviants, the notion of passing is singularly unhelpful. Passing as a narrative assumes that there is a self that masquerades as another kind of self and does so successfully. At various moments, the successful past may cohere into something akin to identity. At such a moment, the passer has become. What a biological female who presents as a butch, what of a biological female who presents as butch passes as male in some circumstances and reads as butch in others and considers herself not to be a woman, but maintains distance from the category of man? For such a subject, identity might be described as a process with multiple sites for becoming and being. To understand such a process, we would need to do more than map psychic and physical journeys between male and female and within queer and straight space. We would need, in fact, to think of in fractal terms about gender geometries. Furthermore, I argue in chapter 4 in my discussion of the Stone Butch, when and where are we and where we discuss the sexualities at stake and certain gender definitions, very different identifications between sexuality, gender, and the body emerge. The Stone Butch, for example, in her self-definition as non-feminine, sexually untouchable female, complicates the idea that lesbians share female sexual practices or women share female sexual desires, or even that masculine women share a sense of what animates their particular masculinities. But yeah, if you're more interested in that, read the rest of the book. And I think that these what is so interesting to me is like because uh, some transsexual stuff gets mentioned here on pages 24 and 25. Um, uh, the terms like non-binary that we are rather more familiar with, um, uh, or trans meaning above, like transgender altogether, like above gender, or um, uh, uh, as a category that wouldn't be the same thing as something like pansexual, right? Because there's some, see this with some of my students too. It's just like, oh, I'm just everything. You can just call me whatever you want. And then there's people who really want to be identified or located in a particular way. And there's ways that that kind of police work, the policing of did you use the right pronoun sort of thing, or especially more so around people my age or in education context, oh, did I say the wrong pronoun or something like that. Uh, there is a kind of hysteria that emerges around this stuff, and a nervousness, that's quite akin to the deconstruction of privileges around race, for example, around like um, white folks being worried about saying something wrong around people of color. So, uh, of course, to go back to Foucault and to Butler, we would look at this not just in terms of identity or identification, and even in Wendy Brown, right? We could go back and like identity is one thing. Are we playing the politics of recognition that Glenn Coulthard has talked about between the liberals versus indigenous theories? Are we talking about regimes of governmentality that become the self-policing of the ways that we talk to each other? Um, uh, I think that this stuff is so much more complex than the ways that and nuanced, of course, in the ways that political discussions or the sort of broad sphere of public opinion about this stuff, uh, how it presents in the cartoonish news media. On page 24, the bathroom discussion comes up. The bathroom, as we know it, actually represents the crumbling edifice of gender in the 20th century. The frequency with which gender deviant women are mistaken for men in public bathrooms suggests that a large number of feminine women spend a large amount of time and energy policing masculine women. Um, and so there's a kind of double standard at work. The men's room, in other words, constitutes both an architecture of surveillance and an incitement to desire, a space of homosocial interactions and of homoerotic interaction. So women um, uh, who enter into a men's bathroom and identify as female masculine, and their pronouns could could change, or their gender identity could change. Uh, the fluidity is more acceptable, according to Halberstam, and men's rooms. So whereas men's rooms tend to operate as highly charged sexual space in which sexual interactions are both encouraged and punished, women's restrooms tend to operate as an arena for the enforcement of gender conformity. And then down a little bit further, still on page 24. The men's bathroom signifies as an extension of the public nature of masculinity. It is precisely not domestic, even though the names given to the sexual function of the bathroom, such as cottage or tea room, suggest it is a parody of the domestic. The codes that dominate within the women's bathroom are primarily gender codes. In the men's room, they are sexual codes. Public sex versus private gender, openly sexual versus discreetly repressive. Bathrooms beyond the home take on the proportions of a gender factory. Over on page 25, it's worth pointing out here that, if only because Garber does not, that the perils for passing female to male trans folks in the men's room are very different from the perils of male to female trans folks in women's bathrooms or in the women's room. On the one hand, the FTM in the men's room is likely to be less scrutinized because men are not quite as vigilant about intruders as women for obvious reasons. On the other hand, if caught, the FTM may face some version of gender panic from the man who discovers him, and it is quite reasonable to expect and fear violence in the wake of such a discovery. The male to female, by comparison, will be more scrutinized in the women's room because, but possibly less open to punishment if caught, because the female to male ventures into male territory with the potential threat of violence hanging over his head. It is crucial to recognize that the bathroom problem is much more than a glitch in the machinery of gender segregation, and is better described in terms of the violent enforcement of our current gender system. And then Halberstam does turn directly towards Jacques Lacan there. I'm not going to cover Lacan right now. I'm going to continue with the bathroom discussion over on page 27. Halberstam says, so what gender are the hundreds of female-born people who are consistently not read as female in the women's room? And because so many women clearly fail the women's room test, why have we not begun to count and name the genders that are clearly emerging at this time? One could answer this question in two ways. On the one hand, we do not name and notice new genders because, as a society, we are committed to maintaining a binary gender system. On the other hand, we could say also that the failure of male and female to exhaust the field of gender variation actually ensures the continued dominance of these terms. precisely because virtually nobody fits the definitions of male and female. The categories gain power and currency from their impossibility. In other words, the very flexibility and the elasticity of the terms man and woman ensures their longevity. To test this proposition, look around any public space and notice how few people present formulaic expression or formulaic versions of gender and how few are unreadable or totally ambiguous. Its Pat character on Saturday Night Live skit dramatized the ways in which people insist on attributing gender in terms of male or female on even the most undecidable characters. The It's Pat character produces laughs by consistently sidestepping gender fixity. Pat's partner has a neutral name, and everything Pat did or said was designed to be read either way. Uh, of course, the enigma that Pat represented could have been solved very easily. Pat's co-workers could simply have asked Pat what gender uh, she or he was or preferred. The project on female masculinity is designed to, this project on female masculinity is designed to produce more than two answers to that question and even to argue for a concept of gender preference as opposed to the compulsory gender binarism. So we see that this Halberstam is like making the case for having more fluid approaches to gender and multiple gender categories, right? So like this is as a theorist, I think that we have to like look back to theorists like Halberstam and see how they've helped to shape discourse in the 21st century. Um, the human potential for incredibly precise classifications has been demonstrated in multiple arenas. Why then do we settle for a paucity of classifications when it comes to gender? A system of gender preferences would allow for gender neutrality until such a time when the child or young adult announces his or her or its gender. Um, uh, so here we see it being theorized, and we see it in much more daily practice in the 21st century. I think that this is the work, for this class anyway, this is the work that good critical theory does, right? Like there's like Halberstam, whether you agree with Halberstam or not, Halberstam definitely like was on to something current in the culture. And I would not say that it's because of Halberstam alone in any way that we have such much more fluid discussions around gender, and we tend to be flexible with the way that our children in elementary or middle school or high school might be, you know, finding their way into what gender identity they want to claim. Um, I think that that's something that's clearly that Halberstam is pointing towards, and is doing the thought work around. So we owe some gratitude, I think, to theorists like Halberstam. I also think that there's a flip side to that, and I think that Halberstam would agree with this, that if we're the flip side is the policing of gender, even the policing of did you use the right pronouns for this person, is that a regime of the politics of recognition, in the sense that neoliberalism creates market categories out of our identities, and so we work for free for Facebook, and we're telling everybody out how we identify as a blah blah blah. I do this sort of thing. If that is part of a regime of oppression, right? That in the way that Foucault has talked about as an extension of governmentality, for example, then I think that we might worry about the lack of sexuality as an ambiguous category that in Judith Butler's Imitation in Gender and Subordination is like exactly what constitutes sexuality is its unfixedness, right? When Butler says like like that she resists sometimes going, or she jokes that she's going up to Yale to be a lesbian, and she says that I'm not going to I'm not saying that I shouldn't call myself this or that we shouldn't have these public categories, but when it comes to actual sexuality, like it the thing that's attractive is the thing that is ambiguous, right? And I can, even in my white male middle class masculinity, I can definitely get behind that it is like that the like that there it's not fun if there's just a script the whole time. Things get really boring. Um, so page 28, as we're kind of nearing towards the end here, it's remarkably easy in this society not to look like a woman. It's relatively difficult by comparison um, not to look like a man. The threats faced by men who do not gender conform are somewhat different than for women. Unless men are consciously trying to look like women, men are less likely than women um, to fail to pass in the restroom. So one question posed by the bathroom problem asks what makes femininity so approximate and masculinity so precise? Or to pose the question with a different spin, why is femininity easily impersonated or performed while masculinity seems resilient to imitation? Of course, this formulation does not easily hold and indeed quickly collapses into the exact opposite. Why is it, in the case of the masculine woman in the bathroom, for example, that one finds the limits of femininity so quickly, whereas the limits of masculinity in the men's room seem fairly expansive? Then there's some turn to Terminator 2, um, minority masculinities, and the art of gender. So we turn to um, uh, Queen Latifah in as Cleo in Set It Off, the film, 1997 film. Um, uh, Moby Dick um, character, and then some uh, um, Jay Gorney images here. Uh, so these become, well, I think that this is nice because they become like visual support for the argument for what the rest of the book is going to be about, and diving into female masculinity. Um, there's a nice description on page 35. The power of the gaze in an Opie portrait always and literally rests with the image. The perpetual stare challenges the spectator's own sense of gender congruity and even self, and it does indeed replicate with difference the hostile stares of the model, probably that the model probably faces every day on the street. So you have to kind of have the book to see the stairs and the images. But of course, when I think about in visual art anyway, and I think about the staring down images, like go right back to Manet's Olympia from the 1860s, right, which recasts. It's a play on Titian's painting of Venus, right? But instead, we get Olympia, who's being figured as a prostitute, and is staring down the viewer, the gaze there. Um, Over on page 41, just as the conclusion here is happening. In this introduction, I've tried to chart the implications of the suppression of female masculinities in a variety of spheres. In relation to cultural studies discussion, the suppression of female masculinities allows for male masculinity to stand unchallenged as the bearer of gender stability and gender deviance. The tomboy, the masculine woman, and the racialized masculine subject, I argue, all contribute to mounting cultural indifference to the masculinity of white males. Gender policing in public bathrooms, furthermore, and gender performances within public spaces produce radically reconfigured notions of proper gender and map new genders onto a utopian vision of radically different bodies and sexualities. By arguing for gender transitivity, for self-conscious forms of female masculinity, for indifference to dominant male masculinities, and for nonce taxonomies, I do not wish to suggest that we can magically wish into being a new set of properly descriptive genders that would bear down on the outmoded categories male and female. Nor do I mean to suggest that the change is simple, and that, for example, by simply creating the desegregation of public toilets, we will change the function of dominant genders within heteropatriarchal cultures. Important point. However, it seems to me that there are some very obvious spaces in which gender difference simply does not work right now, and the breakdown of gender as a signifying system in these arenas can be exploited to hasten the proliferation of alternate gender regimes in other locations. From drag kings to spies with gadgets, from butch bodies to FTM bodies, gender and sexuality and the technologies are already excessively strange. It is simply a matter of keeping them that way. And then in the next paragraph in the middle, in the next chapter, I suggest that the project of historicizing female masculinity must evolve by using the inconsistencies that dominate contemporary discussions of gender to temper the kinds of claims that we are willing to make about gendered subjectivities from other areas. I call this perverse presentism. So the next page is just coverage of the actual chapters there. So that's going to take us to the end of our gender theory week. I assume that many of my watchers or listeners in the United States are familiar with this stuff, but hopefully by looking back to some of the theorists from the 1990s, you get a sense of how the discourse of critical theory has changed and turns into different arenas, whether it's critical race theory or gender theory here as well. In the next video, we're going to be covering, and it might have to be multiple videos. I'll be covering Jacques Derrida's Force of Law essay. It's a difficult essay, especially I think after reading Halberstam's writing is just so clear, and it's just a great academic argument. Um, so yeah, it might take a few videos to get through Jacques Derrida's piece, Force of Law, and then we will do Agamben's State of Exception, and then that will take us to the end of at least this series. And I'll pause. I obviously will be making more lecture videos, but that takes us to the end of what I at least said I was going to do, and it takes us to the end of the readings for my face-to-face students this spring semester as well. Okay, if you can support us on Patreon, that we would really appreciate it. But in any case, have a good morning, evening, afternoon, whenever, wherever you are. Bye.